Imagine this. One morning you wake up, the TV is on, and the news anchor looks straight into the camera and says that today a country has officially defaulted, and its largest debt is not held by a hostile nation, but by a private company. No tanks cross borders, no missiles are fired. There are only numbers, contracts, and debt. And in that moment, the world understands the most dangerous truth of our time. Modern wars are not fought with guns, but with balance sheets. This is the story of a country that was full of weapons but empty of cash, and a company that never had an army yet became more powerful than a state. This is the story of the moment when the world realized that sovereignty itself can be leased. After the Cold War, the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union had collapsed, the West was celebrating. Television screens repeated the same line again and again. History has ended. Capitalism has won. But the real story began right there. The countries most damaged after the Cold War were not superpowers like Russia, but small nations crushed between competing powers. They had no strong institutions, no stable currency, no long-term plan. They had only one thing: debt. IMF loans, World Bank reforms, and private investment contracts were handed out in the name of help. And then, one day, the bill arrived. The villain of this story was not a dictator or a general. The central character was a multinational corporation we will call Atlas Global Resources. It had no flag, no anthem, no army, but it had lawyers, contracts, and dollars, and the dollar is the most dangerous weapon of the modern age. Atlas invested in energy, infrastructure, ports, and logistics. Its model was simple. We lend money when a country is collapsing, and we collect when that country tries to stand back up. On the coast sat a small country we will call Karava. Its population was only 6 million. Its economy depended on tourism and agriculture. Its problems were corruption and mismanagement. Karava had a dream: to build a deep-sea port that would bring trade, jobs, and economic revival. But the port required $4.2 billion, money Karava did not have. Atlas had contracts, Karava had speeches. The deal was signed. The terms looked reasonable. Atlas would invest, build the port, operate it for 35 years, and share profits. Smiling for the cameras, the Prime Minister said this was a partnership, not a surrender. Flashbulbs exploded, hands were shaken, fireworks lit the sky. But buried in the fine print was one line no one read aloud. In case of default, operational control would transfer indefinitely. Construction began. Cranes arrived, Chinese steel, European engineers. Then the global recession hit. Tourism collapsed, the currency crashed, Karava's debt ballooned. Every year, interest, fees, and penalties grew. For Atlas, this was not chaos, it was the business model. Then came the day the finance minister stood at a press conference, tears in his eyes, and said they could no longer meet their obligations. This was not just an economic failure, it was a sovereign one. The next morning, Atlas's logo was on the port. Security was private. Workers were on contracts. The border remained. The flag remained, but control was gone. Karava still existed on paper as a country, but trade rules belonged to Atlas, fees belonged to Atlas, decisions belonged to Atlas. The Prime Minister could give speeches, but he could not stop a ship. The world learned a new rule: whoever controls the cash controls the state. On the shore stood a young man whose father once said the port would be their freedom. The port gleamed, but the gate did not carry the nation's name, it carried the company's. Soon a new sign appeared at the port gate: Authorized Economic Zone. Below it, in smaller letters, Private Jurisdiction. The police uniforms looked the same, the salutes were the same, but on their shoulders was a new patch: Atlas Security Services. Law itself had been leased. The officers were not fired, they were rehired with higher salaries and loyalty clauses stating that their primary duty was the protection of corporate assets. When fishermen protested for their land, they were told they were trespassing on private property. Batons swung, tear gas filled the air, arrests followed. The next day, newspapers reported an illegal protest dispersed at a commercial facility. There was no mention of citizens or rights, only a facility. Local courts refused to hear the case because the contract required international arbitration. The land belonged to Carava, the people belonged to Carava, but justice had been exported to London. Atlas took profits in dollars, while local workers were paid in a collapsing local currency. The central bank printed money, inflation surged, coffee that was cheap yesterday was expensive today. GDP numbers improved on paper, but people grew poorer on the ground. The most dangerous change was not economic, it was psychological. People began to say the government could do nothing. Talk to Atlas. Decisions were being made in boardrooms. The country slipped into shadow governance. AI cameras were installed, surveillance expanded. Everything was justified as private property. A leak revealed plans to neutralize political leaders and influence elections. The president was briefed, but dismissed it as impossible, even though it was already happening. The currency collapsed. Banks imposed withdrawal limits. Black markets flourished. Riots erupted. Elections existed in name only, as funding and media were controlled by Atlas-linked firms. Any candidate who promised to review contracts was buried under raids and scandals. Democracy continued, but the remote control was in someone else's hands. The IMF arrived, subsidies were cut, pensions disappeared, protests filled the streets. One night, a fire broke out near the port. Emergency powers were declared. The army was called in, and within the army, a question emerged. Who are we standing for? Then came another leak, stating clearly that public unrest was acceptable as long as it stayed within projected loss margins. International media asked whether Carava was still a sovereign state. Atlas replied calmly that it operated within the law. There was law, but there was no justice. The country stood at a crossroads, become a full corporate state or challenge the system itself. The final plan was not made in Parliament or the presidential palace. It was made in a university basement where economists, judges, and a colonel agreed there would be no violence, only law used as a weapon. A forgotten clause was activated, stating that the contract remained valid while sovereign recognition continued. Carava went directly to the International Court of Justice. Atlas assumed it was a bluff, but diaspora funding and free legal support kept the case alive. The court issued a temporary order suspending exclusive operational rights. One sentence triggered a domino effect. Insurance withdrew, shipping lines rerouted, banks stepped back, Atlas's stock collapsed, the CEO resigned. The army secured the infrastructure, and this time the order did not come from corporate headquarters. The national flag was raised over the port again. On television, the Prime Minister said only one line: "We are not canceling the contract, we are canceling submission." A settlement followed, shared authority, restructured revenue. Carava did not become a perfect country, but one thing returned: choice. And choice is the foundation of sovereignty. That morning, a ship entered the port. This time, there was no corporate logo, only the national flag. A dock worker whispered, "For the first time, it feels like this land is ours." The moral of this story is not that corporations are evil. The moral is this: when a country does not understand its own economy, someone else will. And then, a nation becomes nothing more than a clause. I'm John. This is the Cinematic History Channel. Please like and subscribe.